Okay, so there'll be 5 weeks of content, and then you'll have a final week where you pretty much have to prepare for the cumulative practical that will be due at the end of the course. On Tuesdays, you'll have learning material available. You'll have your pre-lab quiz due, so that sort of brief preview of the material will prepare you for the pre-lab quiz, and then the previous week's quiz will be due in subsequent weeks as well. So for today, we're going to be looking at week 1, and then next Tuesday, you'll have week 1 weekly quiz due, and then pre-lab quiz for week 2. At the end of the course, you'll have a cumulative practical again, so definitely be sure to brush up on your content, make sure that you're continuously studying older material, such as this week's material, and then you'll have that sort of fresh in your mind in terms of that last week to prepare. In terms of the breakdown of the grading, you have 5 weeks of content. So there are 5 pre-lab quizzes. That's about 10% of your grade, about 20 points. We have 5 weekly quizzes, about 45% of your grade. Those are 18 points each. And then we have 1 cumulative practical. That's going to be the bulk of your grade in terms of that cumulative exam. And that is usually broken down into 3 parts. It's worth 90 points each, but then you have 3 separate parts where you can have sort of 3 mini exams, and you can space it out in that week if you would like to. All right. Okay. Any questions so far? Any questions so far? And feel free to type in the chat box or raise a hand. Yeah, sure, Jess.
Is the anatomy lab graded with the physiology lab, or is it a separate grade in the grade book?
A great question. So for now, it's going to be the labs. They're housed in a different course, so they'll be a different part of the grade book. And then the lecture part, which is ran by Dr. Schlater, will be another Brightspace course. So for now, they are going to be separated, but eventually we will share grades into that common grade book in the lecture course, which will be your overall course grade. So that will end up being a cumulative 1 grade. Hope that answers your question. All right, any other questions? All right, so let's look at the format of the quiz. So you actually have 2 attempts on the quizzes. You don't have to use both, but you can if you would like to. And then obviously the higher attempt is what will be recorded. It's going to be 18 questions, and then it's 18 minutes, so about a minute per question each. Now, the format of each question will differ, and the points of each question will differ. So for some questions, you may have half a point, 1 point, depending on whether you have to include the side. So the side will be important. I'll talk about that when we begin looking at some structures. But if it's right versus left, the name of the structure correctly spelled, and then any other features that may be required. So let's just ask you about a feature within a specific skull bone. So those things will be either fill in the blanks or multiple choice format in those weekly quizzes. The things that will be on the quiz will be from the structure list. This is why it's important to review that list in addition to what we go over today. It's any identifiable or testable structure, preferably in the format that it's in on that list. So you may find alternate terms for certain anatomical structures. You may find some variations. And so the structure that's listed on the list is going to be the preferential term, but I will usually go over the quizzes after, and any minor spelling errors or acceptable alternate terms, I will adjust your grading for those sorts of things after. All right, so I only do this after everyone has taken the quiz, so you may not see it show up in your grade book right away, but by the following week, you should see any minor spelling errors if you had 1 or 2 characters off, or any alternate accepted terms, you may see your grade adjusted. Now, the weeks of content, we're going to have the skull first. We're going to have the appendicular skeleton, so the rest of the appendicular beyond the skull, excuse me, the appendicular being the limbs, and then the brain and axial skeleton. So the skull being a part of the axial, and then in 3, we're going to look at the rest of the axial skeletal, which is the spine and then the brain. And then weeks 4 and 5 will be the upper and lower extremities. Now, course resources will be your anatomy atlas, which is the time atlas. If you have that one, it's great. If you have grants or netters, that's acceptable as well. That will just help to give you alternate ways to look at the structures, look at terms. And so beyond what we look at here, the images we have, also the lecture notes. So I think that's going to be the best place to look at, making any notes here, and then some practice questions that we do go over in class. And finally, if you need to reach me again, Zoom appointments, as far as office hours are available, and then email is another perfectly acceptable way as well. All right. Any questions before we start? Any final questions? Okay. So let's begin by thinking about the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. So that's one of the major divisions of the skeletal system. So the axial is going to be everything in the midline. And if you think about this functionally, it's going to help to maintain the structure of the rest of the body. It's going to be sort of a support system in the middle. So that includes the skull, superiorly the spine, which is really the vertebral column, the fused vertebra, as well as the sternum and the rib cage. So all of this is the central or axial skeleton. Then we have the appendicular skeleton, which is really the limb structures. These are functionally suited for movement or function. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a question. So during the quiz, you could go over the time limit. No, it does not change your grade when you go over the time limit, and it does accept the answers that you wrote beyond that time limit. Yep. Yep. Okay. All right, so functionally, the appendicular skeleton is really important for mobility, flexibility, and movement, which is really important as humans in terms of evolution and the ability to move around, etc. This includes the shoulder joint, which articulates to the upper limb itself, the humerus, and then the forearm bones, as well as the hip joint, similarly articulating to the femur and the rest of the lower limb bones. So the hip joint and shoulder joint are really what begin the entire appendicular skeleton. Now, we also want to think about other bones like the hyoid bone, and the patella, which is a sesamoid bone. These are bones that sort of have an exception to the rest of the axial skeleton. They don't articulate with any other bone directly. These bones are usually held in place by ligaments and tendons that secure them to the structures around them. So the hyoid is one example, secured by the hyoid muscles, the strap muscles, and then the patella is another example, secured by the quadriceps tendon or the patella tendon. So apart from those two examples, all of the other bones of the skeletal system are somehow articulated by cartilage or other types of adhesions to another type of bone. Let's look at the skull. So in this lab, we're going to look at the skull only. And then in week 3, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the rest of the axial skeleton. Now, the skull is going to be the top of the axial skeleton. Obviously, it's going to house the brain. So very important to think about how it is a case to protect the delicate brain tissue. It's going to consist of 22 bones in 2 sets. So some are cranial bones. They're more towards the top. And these create sort of the skull cavity, which again houses the brain. This is called the cranium or the calvarium. And this is formed by 8 bones, which some are singular, some are paired. We'll talk about which ones are singular versus paired, but they together form this cavity that houses the brain. Now, the others are the lower facial bones, and there are 14 of these bones, including the mandible, which is what forms the jaw, and these together are what give the face its structure, its support, including the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, maintaining those openings, right? So this is going to be really important for our sensory organs and a lot of the nervous structures that are communicating the eyes, the ears, the nose, etc. Let's think about the cranial bones. So we have 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones. So parietal bones are going to be on top, And parietal actually means the top or ceiling. Temporal bones also paired. They're at the bottom, sort of the lower part of that cavity. One occipital bone posteriorly, one frontal bone anteriorly. Internally, we have the sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid bone is sort of buried in between the skull, the calvaria, and the facial bones. And then we have the ethmoid bone, which is sort of above and behind the nasal bones themselves. Okay, the ethmoid bone. So these are the bones that form the cranium or the calvarium. And again, that will house the brain. Let's look at some of the sutures. So these are the ways in which these brains are adhered to one another. And this is very interesting because it creates these fontanelles during infancy and before birth. So when an infant is born, the fetal cranium can be compressed because of the connective tissue that is found at these sutures. Now, within the first 2 years of life, these are going to be ossified to actually form bone. So this allows for the brain to be malleable, sort of moldable as that fetus passes through the birth canal. And then within those early years of life, that eventually becomes bone. So we have these fontanelles, which are found to represent, we have these suture lines, which are found to represent where these fontanelles used to be. And these are remaining to form the cranial sutures. So we've got 4 cranial sutures, the sagittal suture, which is where we used to have the fontanelle between the parietal bones. This is a more of a longitudinal suture. The coronal suture, this is between the frontal bone and the paired parietal bones. Okay, this is the coronal suture. We have the lambdoid suture. And the lambdoid suture is the point between the occipital bone and the paired parietal bones. And it's sort of this V-shaped, inverted V-shaped suture. Lastly, we have the squamous suture. The squamous suture separating the temporal bone, the lower part of the calvarium from the parietal bone, the top of the calvarium. So the squamous suture. Let's look at each bone one by one. And what we're going to point out are the important features, landmarks, openings that can be found in each of these skull bones. And it will be important to notice, again, the side on which they're found. So I kind of want to start by talking about just overall the side, right and left here. So as we're looking at this image, we want to think about the anatomical position. And this was a part of your earlier packet that was posted on Brightspace to prepare you for this lab, but thinking about how anatomical position is that general standard position that we describe the body in terms of looking at various anatomical regions and structures. So we want to think about the face, the head facing forward, nose pointing forward, palms facing forward, toes facing forward, and the arms out at the side of the body in the supinated position. So that is going to be helpful as we think about right versus left. So right is going to be the right of that structure. It's really important not to put your right and left into it because that can sometimes be confusing, but the right and left of the structure that you're observing in its anatomical position. So in this instance, we're looking at the left side of this structure. So this would be the left orbit. And this would be the right side of this structure, which is the right orbit. Now, if you notice, it's going to be inverted. If you're looking at the structure sort of face on, it's going to be inverted to your right and left. So that can sometimes be helpful. But if we were to flip the structure around and look at it posteriorly, it would not always be inverted. So just bear that in mind. But looking at the structure face on, it's usually inverted, left side of the structure versus right. Okay. Now, the frontal bones, important landmarks here are going to be the supraorbital foramen. This is an opening that's found above the orbit. And then this is the frontal bone itself. Now, the frontal bone is one bone again, but it is one of the bones that becomes fused as a part of fetal development. So in some rare instances, you may actually see an existing suture separating 2 frontal bones, but again, that is very rare. Now, the parietal bones, again, found on top of the skull. These are found between the frontal and occipital bones, sort of sandwiched in between. And these are connected by the sagittal suture. and then separated from the frontal bones by the coronal suture and from the occipital bone by the lambdoid suture. Looking at the temporal bone, so the temporal bone is really forming the floor of the cranium. Really important for protecting the temporal lobes of the brain as well. Now, these have several bony landmarks that are important. The zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic process helps to form the zygomatic arch. And so this is the union of the zygomatic process coming from the temporal bone and the temporal process coming from the zygomatic bone. And together they form this arch-like structure at the side of the skull. Now, this is clinically important because it's a region that's often fractured, especially, boxers, if you get a blow to the face, it can be very easily fractured because of the way it's arched, this sort of thin part of the bone. And then also a lot of important neurovascular structures pass through here that can be injured if this again becomes injured. So really important to think about how those two parts of two different bones forms this one structure, the zygomatic arch. Next, we have the external acoustic meatus. This is actually an opening. And this is another thing to think about. A meatus is an opening that goes through a bone, whereas a foramen is an opening that is really not a passageway, it's just an opening in the structure. So we talked about the supraorbital foramen earlier. That's just an opening that allows a nerve or artery to go through. A meatus is actually a passageway that leads deep, sort of like a tunnel. So the external acoustic meatus is another feature here in the temporal bone that actually leads internally to the internal acoustic meatus. Then we have the styloid process. This is a sort of sharp inferior projection on the temporal bone. This is going to be an attachment for some of the muscles of mastication, for example. And then the mastoid process is another projection found. This is a more roughened, larger projection posteriorly that is another attachment for muscles such as the sternocleidomastoid muscle. All right, let's look at some other features. Now, if we invert the skull here, again, thinking about right and left, the right is going to be still inverted because we're looking at the inferior view of the structure. So this will be the right side of the structure. This will be the right side of the structure, and this will be the left side of the structure. So still inverted to your right and left. Now, features that we can see inferiorly in the temporal bone would be the mandibular fossa. This is a depression inferiorly that helps to form the temporomandibular joint, which is the union between the mandible and the temporal bone. This is really the jaw, right? That movable joint that creates the jaw. We also want to think about the carotid canal. The carotid canal is the opening that allows the internal carotid arteries to enter the skull and really supply most of the brain. And then the jugular foramen is more posteriorly, so internal, carotid canal. And then the jugular foramen, which is also a passageway that allows things like the internal jugular vein and some of the cranial nerves to pass through the skull as well. Now, the jugular foramen, interestingly, is a shared canal. It's a shared opening. So this is between the temporal bone anteriorly and the occipital bone posteriorly, right? So it's important to think about how those two bones together form this opening as opposed to the carotid canal, which is purely formed by the temporal bone. Lastly, the internal acoustic meatus. So we talked about the external acoustic meatus, which is the external part of that canal. And then the internal acoustic meatus can be appreciated from an internal view. This is a superior view. And then that is the opening leading to the inner part of the skull, right? And then looking at the superior view. So thinking about how when the view changes, so now we're looking down into the floor of the calvarium or the skull. And then now the right and left is going to be the same as your right and left. So this is the right side of the structure now that we're looking superiorly down. And this is the left side of the structure. So this would be, for example, the right internal acoustic meatus versus the left internal acoustic meatus. So now this becomes the same as your